Hey, good morning and welcome to church at River Point Church, West End Church. So glad you guys are either here or watching online. If you're down at Missouri City, I'm so glad I'm not there with you guys. My name is Nathan, by the way, and I get to lead our Missouri City campus. So if you're at Missouri City, I'm sorry I'm not there, but make sure and go say hi to Pastor Terrace. Pastor T should be down there. If you're visiting, give him your number. He'll give it to me. I'd love to catch up with you sometime this week. If you're at West End, Dean King is down there. So find him, and he'll introduce you to some fine folks down there. I also want to say hi to all the people over in Lakeside today. We have a full crowd in the house here in Richmond, but wherever you are, I am glad that you are here today. I'm super excited to be a part of the teaching team for this series. We are in the third week of a series that we're calling Let's Rebuild, and it's been amazing. I've been so encouraged for the first 2 weeks. Listen, guys, 2020, I was talking to a friend a few weeks ago, and he put it in a beautiful way. He said 2020 was a bomb that went off in many people's lives. And in 2021, in these first few months, I think most of us are doing the same thing. We're kind of surveying the damage, right? We're kind of trying to see what did 2020 expose? What did 2020 kind of break down that we thought was really strong, maybe stronger than we thought it was in hindsight? And so this idea of rebuilding is very timely. And so we've been looking at an Old Testament book and an Old Testament man by the name of Nehemiah and looking and seeing what his experience with rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem can teach us about rebuilding things in our life. Because as we're surveying the damage, we know we have to rebuild. Sometimes we want to rebuild things the way that they were before. Other times we want to rebuild stronger, right? We look at it and go, I thought it was better. I thought it was stronger. I thought it was the way it was supposed to be, and it wasn't. So as we rebuild, we want to make some changes and tweak a few things. And so that's what we're doing. So 2 weeks ago in part one of this, we met Nehemiah. And Nehemiah was a Jewish man living in the 5th century BC, so about 450 years before Jesus showed up in human history. He's living in the Middle East, okay? He's living in a town of Susa, which is kind of part of modern day Iran. And at that time, that entire area was ruled by the Persian Empire. And he was serving as the cupbearer to the Persian king by the name of Artaxerxes. And so we meet Nehemiah in chapter 1. And what we find out very early in the first couple of verses is that though he's in Susa, he receives a report from his brother and some other people of his nationality who are living back in Jerusalem. And the report is not a good report. The report is that the people, their emotional condition, their spiritual condition, their mental condition, it's in shambles, right? They're broken down people, and his heart breaks for that. But not only that, but the wall around Jerusalem, which was a very important thing at all cities at that particular time, the wall that had been destroyed when the Babylonians came in 150 years before, it was in shambles. They had tried rebuilding, it didn't work. And so not only were they broken emotionally and spiritually, but they were broken physically, and the wall around their community, their city, was broken down as well. And so Nehemiah was broken. He recognized, he was brought this news, and it immediately broke his heart. He recognized that something was not the way it should be. And Patrick kind of introduces this idea of holy discontent. It's when we recognize that something is out of order. Something is not in its right place. Something breaks our heart. We receive a report or we see something on the news, and it moves us in such a way that we start to think about and pray about, God, is this something that you've created me to address? Is there something about this not being right that maybe part of my unique makeup and my personality and my gifts, I can actually do something about that problem? And so that's what Nehemiah did. He prayed. He said, God, this breaks my heart. I want to do something about it. I want to make sure that you're in that, and yet this is going to be a risky proposition. I'm in a place of privilege, some comfort. I'm a cupbearer in the king's court. I'm doing all this kind of stuff. Going back to Jerusalem is a risky endeavor. I'm going to have to ask for permission to leave the court and go back and do that. I'm going to ask to go back and rebuild a wall in an empire that's not really ruled by my people. And so I don't know what the king is going to say. And so that second chapter of Nehemiah, which was last week, if you're watching these in order, basically what Nehemiah was able to do is his faith in God and his conviction that God had broken his heart for the reason of leading the charge to rebuild was enough to move him beyond his fear of what the king might say. And he took that first step of obedience, trusting that God would kind of make a way, and God did. And so he was given permission by the king. He was given the resources by the king. He made his way back to Jerusalem. He started to recruit his team of builders. He surveyed the damage. He realized this is an overwhelming task. It's 2.5 miles of wall, towers and bridges and doors and gates and all sorts of things. And so God, if you're in this, we're gonna put this team together. And we kind of ended on this high note in chapter 2, verses 18 and 19, in which he kind of organized his building team. He said, let's start rebuilding. And so today we're gonna continue that story in chapter 4. And I'm so glad that you're here because chapter 4 is my favorite. I'm gonna be real honest. I'm biased because I get to teach it, but chapter 4 is my favorite because what we're gonna see is the way that Nehemiah faces, deals with, handles, defeats really, opposition. These voices of discouragement that are gonna come into his life from different places that tell him he's not good enough, that he doesn't have what it takes. And I think if we study this, it can be very much a help for us because I don't think any of us are immune from experiencing discouragement or experiencing opposition in the things that we're trying to accomplish in life. Specifically, some of the things that God has given us a burden to do. And so what we're gonna do is we're gonna look at what Nehemiah did, and I think we can use it as kind of a blueprint for our own lives. And the truth is, you're gonna have people that are gonna question your ability. You're gonna have people that are gonna question if you have what it takes. You're gonna have people that are questioning whether or not you actually heard that thing from the Lord or not. And without a strategy, it's just not gonna work. In fact, that's where I wanna start today. This is one of the things I came up with as I'm thinking about Nehemiah 4. It's this idea that without a strategy for dealing with opposition in your life, the gravity of discouragement, think about that, the gravity of discouragement will keep you from accomplishing what you were put on this earth to do. That if you don't have a strategy for dealing with discouragement and opposition, then it's just gonna be too heavy in order to make forward progress. You probably don't have enough just internal fortitude to overcome the power that is discouragement and opposition that you're gonna go through and that you're gonna experience in life. And so that's the idea about what we're gonna talk about today. But before we get into chapter 4, I wanna read 2 verses from chapter 2 because they're gonna introduce us to a few men who are gonna serve as one of the sources of discouragement in Nehemiah's life. And so this way, when we read it in chapter 4, you'll know who they are. So just to kind of give you some perspective, Nehemiah has gone into the king's presence. He has asked for permission and the king has said yes. And the very next verse after the king says yes, in chapter 2, verse 10, we read this. It says, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. So you got Sanballat, you got Tobiah. Now, fast forward a few verses, Nehemiah has made his way back to Jerusalem. He surveyed the damage. He started building his team. He said, let's start rebuilding. And in verse 19, we read this. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about this, they mocked and ridiculed us. So you have Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem. And just to give you a little perspective as to who these three men are, Jerusalem is right there in kind of the south central of what we know as modern day Israel, right there in the Middle East, still a city to this day. And that's kind of the home of the Jewish people. It's where they made their temple. It's where they made their home. Prominent even in Jesus' day, prominent today. Right? Well, around Jerusalem to the north is an area called Samaria. It's where we get the name Samaritans from. And Sanballat was the official that was kind of overseeing that area. He didn't have a lot of power because it was the Persian Empire and he wasn't Persian, but he was, overseeing at the privilege and with the blessing of the king, that area there. Tobiah would oversee Ammon. He was an Ammonite, so he was overseeing Ammon. That was just to the east. Okay, so the opposite side of the Mediterranean Sea. So if you go further inland back towards modern day Iran, that's Ammon and that's where Tobiah is. And then we read about Geshem the Arab, and Geshem was the overseer of the area south of Jerusalem, a very large area that went from South Jerusalem all the way around to Egypt. So literally on 3 sides of the city, you have these 3 men who don't want to see Nehemiah be successful in rebuilding the wall around Jerusalem. Because another player on the field, they would see that maybe as a threat to their authority and a threat to the people groups that they were overseeing, right? And these sources of discouragement that we see in Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem, really what they are is they're kind of these external outside sources of discouragement of people who don't have a lot of skin in the game when it comes to rebuilding the walls, and yet they kind of want to hate from the outside. That's why I like to call this outside source of discouragement the haters, right? We all have haters in our life. I don't know if you're a big Taylor Swift fan, but she tells us very honestly, the haters are gonna hate. That's what they do. And I could just wrap this up and say, shake it off, but I actually don't think that's a great strategy for dealing with the haters in your life, okay? Because here's the deal. We all have haters, right? They're like this in our life. Sometimes we've created haters, let's be honest. We've been rude, we've been unkind. Maybe we've been a source of discouragement in their life, and so we've created a hater. Other people just have issues. And those issues show up in the form of opposition and ridicule and mockery towards us, right? But here's what haters do. They don't like you. They want you to fail. They want you to look foolish in doing so. Many times they're actually threatened by the things that you've set out to do. They're threatened by your success, but they're haters and they ridicule and they mock, and that's exactly what these three do. Let's pick up the story in verse 1 of chapter 4. When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates in the army of Samaria, he said, what are those feeble Jews doing? I want you to pay attention to these questions because it's exactly what haters do for you and me. What are they feeble Jews? They call you names, right? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? They think God's gonna rescue them. Will they finish in a day? Do they realize how big of a task this is? He goes on. Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are? They start to question the tools and the resources and the supplies that we have to accomplish this. And if it wasn't enough that Sanballat was saying these things, he's got his little sidekick, Tobiah, saying this. Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, what are they building? Even a fox climbing up on it would break down their wall of stones. Now, I don't know if you read the Bible the same way I do, but I like to visualize things. And I see Sanballat as kind of the ringleader of this outside opposition. He's kind of the ringleader of the haters. And Tobiah is kind of like that little like, I don't know, shortier, peskier, more annoying guy. It's like, yeah, what he said, foxes. You know, am I the only one that like visualizes this? But that's what it is. I mean, I've experienced that exact same thing in my life. In fact, I think I've actually been Tobiah at different times in my life. So that's never a good thing when you identify with a bad character in a Bible story, but that's neither here nor there. So you got Sanballat, and he's questioning it. This is what haters do, right? They mock you. They question your intellect. They question your ability. They question your confidence and your commitment. They question the plans that you have. Like, there's no way that plan is good enough. You're not gonna be able to accomplish that. They question your resources, the supplies. Maybe you're leading a team to accomplish something, and they start to question like, really? You picked that guy for your team? There's no way, okay? I'm sorry. Like, you may have had a chance, but you picked Bob, and Bob's not a good worker, and so, sorry if your name's Bob. My dad's name's Bob. I didn't mean that. But they question everything about you, and they question your plan, right? This is what they do. Or maybe they just add on like Tobiah, right? They just want to be a part of like the cool kid group. Well, surely I'm not the only one to experience something like this, right? Surely maybe you've had a coworker in the past, or you've had a neighbor or a family member who has straight up come up to your face and says, I don't think you're good enough. I don't think you deserve that promotion. I don't think you deserve that thing that you're working towards. In fact, I don't think you're good enough. I don't think you're smart enough. I've seen your plan's not gonna work. It's gonna fail. You're gonna look foolish. Turn back now. And we've received that direct kind of opposition. But maybe more common than that is when you hear about people talking about you behind your back. That there's these voices of opposition, there's these voices of discouragement, but they don't even have the guts to come up and tell it to your face. And so in the break room or in the dining room at your family gathering, you kind of overhear and you realize they're talking about you. And they're discouraging you from trying to accomplish something that God has given you a burden to set out and do. What do you do when you hear things like that? How do you respond in the face of direct or indirect opposition? If you're anything like me, you don't respond the best way. You might lash back out at somebody who's mocking you. You might kind of bow up and be like, hey, nah, you're not gonna intimidate me, I'm gonna intimidate you. Or maybe you start to scheme and plot and figure out ways to get back at them. I think it's important that maybe we look and see what Nehemiah does because he has a great example. Here's what he does. The very next verse after these come, he says, hear us, our God, for we are despised. He goes straight to prayer. He hears these things, Sanballat's questioned him, Tobiah's added on, and rather than saying anything directly back to them, he says, hear us, O God, for we are despised. Now listen to this prayer, this is great. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders. So Nehemiah, like in chapter 1 and in chapter 2, when his heart was broken or he was scared of facing the king, his immediate response was to pray, to take whatever it was that he was feeling and experiencing and give it to God. So he prayed. But you and I just read this prayer. This is a real prayer. This isn't the nicest prayer we've ever read, right? Like what he's actually saying, God, I want them to experience what it's like to be plundered in a land of captivity. I want the insults that they're hurling to me to be put back on them. Nehemiah is basically saying, God, listen, I'm not God, but if I were you, I would just wipe them off the face of the earth. It'd make everything so much easier. Right now, we read prayers like this, and every so often we go, is that okay? Like, is that just like exposing part of the human sinful side of Nehemiah? I love that prayer. Like, I love prayers like that. You know why I love prayers like that? Because we know exactly how Nehemiah is feeling. He's angry. He's felt disrespected. He may feel betrayed. Right? And so he takes these emotions, these very real emotions, and with no filter whatsoever, he says, God, this is how I'm feeling. Would you just do this to them? Like, again, I'm gonna trust you to do what you do, but if you're looking for some suggestions, I've got a few things that you might wanna do with Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem. And I love that because let's cut it here, okay? God knows how you're feeling. God knows what kind of choice words are running through your mind as you're receiving these mocks and as you're receiving these insults. God knows exactly how you want to respond. And God's big enough to take it. And maybe the healthiest thing we can do with those kinds of emotions and those kinds of experiences is take them to God and leave room for God to deal with those people. Leave room for God to deal with those insults. In the New Testament, Paul writing to the Romans 12:19, if you want to jot it down, he says, do not take revenge, my brothers, but leave room for the wrath of God. I love that instruction because that's exactly what Nehemiah does here. I think it's the healthiest way to deal with these kinds of experiences and these kinds of emotions, because if we don't give them to God, then what they end up doing is they end up motivating us and moving us to either lash back out in anger or violence or revenge, or even worse, we just kind of bury them down deep and then they kind of ferment and fester and take root and they become resentment, they become hatred, and one day we're just gonna blow up. And so what Nehemiah does is so beautiful because he says, God, this is how I feel. I'm giving it to you and I'm getting back to work. And that's exactly what he did. Look at the very next verse. So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half of its height, for the people worked with all their heart. God, this is what I want you to do, but I trust you to deal with it. We're gonna get back to work. And they were successful in doing this. Now, unfortunately, like most haters, these three didn't go away easily. If their words weren't gonna be enough, they were gonna step up their game. So look at what we read in the very next verse. It says, but when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod, who just happened to join in on the fun, when they heard that the repairs to Jerusalem's walls had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, they were very angry. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. So, you know, the sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Okay, we tried that one. Okay, if words never hurt you, we're gonna try sticks and stones now. We're gonna get violent. We're gonna threaten physical violence. The discouragement had elevated from verbal to physical. That's what the threat was. And if it wasn't enough that the folks in the north and the east and the south were against us, then this just said the Ashdodites, the folks from Ashdod, which happens to be on the west side where the kind of the coast of the Mediterranean is, that they've jumped in on the fun. So Nehemiah is literally leading a rebuilding effort, and folks on all four sides of the city want to see him fail. And folks on all four sides of the city want to see him look foolish in doing so. They don't want him to be successful. And so that's what Nehemiah is up against. And the problem here is that Nehemiah has kind of taken the brunt of this opposition, the brunt of this discouragement, but he's not the only one that's hearing these threats of physical violence, and that opposition starts to take a toll on the team of builders that he has. Look at what it says in the very next verse. But we prayed to our God. This is what his response was. We prayed to God. We posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. So before we get to what happened to the insiders, he had this violent threat. He prayed to God because that's always his first thing. But then he took another step and he started planning, right? He was going to make the right preparation. So if they were going to be violent, he was going to be prepared for that. And there's nothing unspiritual about being prepared for the things that are facing you. There's nothing unspiritual about taking another step beyond prayer to look at a situation and go, how can I plan? How can I adjust? How can I be better prepared to face what is coming my way? But as I mentioned, it wasn't just Nehemiah that was getting it. So as the next verse says, meanwhile, the people in Judah, these are the builders, they said, the strength of the laborers is giving out, and there's so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall. So it's not just opposition on the outside. It's not just sources of discouragement that are on the outside being spoken to the inside, but now there are these inside voices of discouragement, right? And that's the second greatest source of discouragement that you and I will face. If the outside are the haters, then the inside is this inside voice, okay, an inside voice of doubt, an inside voice of struggle. We start to question our own abilities. I think I wrote it down here, is it? Is it there? There it is. It's this inner voice, right? It's where you and I look at a task. You and I, like, we're questioning ourselves. God, do I have it? God, did I get this wrong? Is this not an instruction that you gave me? Have I bit off more than I can chew? Right? And so we do that. Even the most confident of us struggle with that inside voice of doubt from time to time. Right? And if it's not that voice right inside of us, then maybe it comes from our team that we've assembled, right? Because not everything that we set out to accomplish is a personal thing. It's a personal thing in which we recruit a team and we go and accomplish something together. So maybe it's members of our team, kind of like it was for Nehemiah. Or maybe it's people around us, what one of the authors I read this week called friendly fire. Maybe it's folks who have encouraged you to get into that thing. They said, yes, I believe that's what God has put in front of you. You should walk into that, be obedient, take a step of faith. They were all for you. And then somewhere along the way, they look and go, oh, wait, that is a big task. Maybe you should rethink it. You know, it's those folks that you would never expect to change their tune. And that's in fact what they did. And so you expect them to encourage you, and then they're discouraging you. And these inside voices of discouragement, kind of these inside sources of opposition, if you will, I think they can be even more difficult to overcome than the outside haters, because it's like you expect the haters to discourage you, but you never expect people inside of your own circle of trust to do that. And that's what Nehemiah was facing here, which is what makes his response to this so helpful for people like you and me, because there is gonna be that inside voice. There are gonna be people who change their tune from time to time. Look at what Nehemiah did. It says, after I looked things over, after I took a step back, I said, wait, okay, this is more than outside, this is inside too. After I looked things over, I stood up and I said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people. You're gonna see that phrase twice. That's the insider group, right? He's kind of like looking in the mirror. He's giving himself a pep talk. He says, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome. Fight for your families. Fight for your sons and your daughters. Fight for your wives and your homes. And so Nehemiah, after surveying and kind of taking stock of where everything is, he remembers that God had already moved him beyond his fear into faith. He had already come so far from chapter 1 to ask for permission and get the resources needed and build a team so that they could start rebuilding the wall. They've already accomplished half of their task. He's reminding himself of that. And then he's also reminding himself and his building team, listen, this isn't something that we just decided to do one day. This is something that God broke my heart for, God gave me a burden for, and he set us out on this course. And it's not just that, he's reminding them, God is awesome and great. God is never intimidated. God is never without the ability. God is never without the resources. And so knowing that God is with us in this, let's fight. Let's fight for our families. Let's fight for our children. Let's fight for our neighbors. Let's fight. And that's one of the things you have to understand about dealing with and defeating discouragement, is that discouragement is not easy, okay? It's not easy to deal with it. It's going to be a fight. It's going to be a fight. It's going to be bloody. It's going to be hard. You're going to be hurt and maimed at times, but you've got to keep moving forward. If you don't have the internal fortitude and strength, like most of us don't, you've got to let the strength and the power of God fuel your resolve to stare opposition in the face and keep moving forward. Again, it's not easy, but listen, if you really listen to that voice of doubt, that inside voice of doubt, or you let that friendly fire take root in your heart, you're actually doing something much more dangerous than just letting it convince you that you're not good enough. Because the more you pay attention to that voice, the more you entertain the idea that God has placed a task in front of you and said that you are responsible for all of the lifting to get the job done. And that's just not true. That will never be true. God's not gonna call you to do something and then take his hands out and step out of the situation and say, good luck with that on your own. That's just not what God calls us to. God is always calling us into a partnership. That's why it's important to keep coming back to God in prayer, just like Nehemiah does, and reminding yourself, listen, God, I'm trusting you here, right? I know that you're capable of doing whatever you put your mind to do, and I believe that you have called me to do this. So I'm gonna take one more step of faith. I'm trusting you to meet me there. We're gonna meet somewhere in the middle. God, I'm gonna go 90, you're gonna come 10, or I'm gonna go 10 and you're gonna come 90. Whatever that ratio is, God, all I know is I can't do this by myself. And God's going, yeah, exactly. You can't do this by yourself. But you plus me, we can accomplish it. And that's what Nehemiah did. He never relied on his own strength. He never relied on his own intellect. He never thought that his plan was the best plan. He prayed through every step of that, understanding that God had called him into a partnership to accomplish something even greater than Nehemiah could have done on his own. So knowing that he was outnumbered, look at what Nehemiah did. Look at how he adjusted his plan as we finish the story starting in verse 16. From that day on, half of my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah who were building the wall. This is all kind of the description of what his plan entailed, right? Those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other, and each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked. We were always prepared. We had a plan. But the man who sounded the trumpet stayed with me. Okay, there's a reason for that, because I said to the nobles, the officials, the rest of the people, talking to my crew, the work is extensive and spread out, and we are widely separated from each other along the wall, right? We are vulnerable as we're spread out working. So here's the plan to address that. Wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, join us there, and our God will fight for us. I love that verse. Maybe my favorite verse in the entire chapter. He's making his plan. He's adjusting his plan. He's coming up with some really great ideas. Listen, we're spread out. If they decide to come at us from one side, and we only have 1/4 of our crew there, we can't possibly defend ourselves. So I'm gonna have this trumpet player guy, and he's gonna walk around with me. And when we know that they're coming from one direction or another, you meet me there. I'm gonna sound the trumpet. We're gonna show up in force, and they're gonna be intimidated, and it's not gonna work. I love this, but meanwhile, it's not just up to us to defend ourselves, because our God will fight for us. Discouragement is a battle in which we fight and God fights. And we're able to defeat discouragement and move forward to what God's called us to. This is the blueprint. This is what Nehemiah has shown us is an effective means of facing discouragement and defeating it and moving forward into that thing that we know God wants us to do. It's as simple as this, really. The first step is to pray. Whenever you recognize these voices of discouragement, you start to realize that there's opposition. You've made some progress. Maybe you're halfway there like Nehemiah was, and they start to come out of the woodwork, and they're scheming, and they're plotting, and they don't want it to work. You've got to pray about that, right? And you pray about it. You remind yourself, God, you got me into this. I'm trusting you to be there. And then you plan. This is where you get strategic. You think logically. You bring in a couple trusted sources. You go, okay, listen, this is what I'm trying to do. Do you think this is gonna work? And those trusted sources go, I think you need to maybe change your idea here, or maybe change your strategy there. But yeah, keep moving forward with that, because after you've done that, and after you've kind of given yourself this pep talk that God is gonna meet you there, you press on. You keep moving. You keep swimming, right? That's what we do. And this is extremely practical. Let me tell you why this is practical, because I don't know if anybody in this room or sitting at home watching online, Weston, Missouri City, I don't know if any of us are gonna be given like this charge from God to go rebuild the wall of a city. Okay, we can't just take what Nehemiah was tasked with doing and say, okay, we're gonna do something similar. But Nehemiah's heart was broken for the walls of the city, and your heart is gonna be broken, or you're gonna come to a place where you experience holy discontent for something that's true and meaningful and important to you. You're gonna look at your family and go, man, my marriage is a wreck. It's not supposed to be this way. I know I love her, I know she loves me, but this is not sustainable. This is not gonna work. I've gotta do something about this. My heart is broken. I feel like God wants me to do something. I'm gonna take some steps of faith. And along the way, maybe you're praying about it, you're doing different things. They start to come back at you with opposition. Or you got a friend that's like, man, I would give up if I were you. I don't even think it's worth salvaging, right? That's kind of that friendly fire. Oh, really? You're the one discouraging me to do that? So you go back to God and say, God, you're the one that broke my heart for this. You're the one that said I need to address this. So I'm gonna need to see you come along my side and partner with me to accomplish this this thing so I can rebuild my marriage, so I can rebuild that relationship with my family member, my son or my daughter. God, there's something going on at work and it just doesn't feel right. And I don't know, but maybe you allowed me to get that last promotion because I have some influence in the office. And so I'm just gonna try and start doing some things that changes the tone, that changes the culture around here. And when you start to make that progress, you find that there are people that don't want to see you succeed. And you go, what do I do, God? You go back and you pray to God. God, you did this. You started me on this course. You told me you'd meet me there in the middle. So this is my plan. If it's not a good plan, tell me that so I can adjust. But I'm going to keep moving forward because you have given me this task and I trust you to fight for me. Listen, left alone, discouragement just grows. It doesn't just sit there. It grows, it festers, it takes root, it turns into things like despair, it turns into things like hopelessness. Ultimately, it turns into something like depression, right? It makes you feel like a victim. And that's not to say that you haven't been hurt and that hurt isn't real. But if you kind of take a victim mindset or a passive mindset to all the things that have happened to you, all the things that people have said to you, then you're never gonna move beyond what other people have done to you to own what you can do in response to go beyond and move ahead and move forward. Discouragement has this paralyzing effect. If you don't work with it, then it's gonna paralyze you. You'll get stuck and you feel like the trajectory of your life is just running in mud or quicksand. And if you've ever experienced a season in which you feel stuck, it might be worth asking yourself, is there discouragement that's gotten me so weighed down that I haven't dealt with? Or maybe I've become so preoccupied with what other people say or what that voice of self-doubt is telling me that I can't do that I've never addressed it and taken another step forward. Maybe most importantly, discouragement, if you don't address it, if you don't defeat it, discouragement will keep you from experiencing a situation in which God shows up and makes a way where you thought there was no way. You see, I believe every single one of us was created with a unique purpose and plan for our life by a God who loves you, who made a way for you to have a real relationship with him through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And if you're gonna experience the best of a relationship with God, if you're gonna grow in your faith, which means if you're gonna learn how to trust God more and take bigger and bigger steps of faith and giant leaps of obedience in areas of your life that you may have never thought of giving God access, it's gonna start with taking that first step and putting God to the test and saying, God, if you don't show up, I'm gonna fall on my face. So I'm gonna take a step there. And then you know what God does? He shows up. He shows up. He shows up. He makes his appearance. He makes his presence felt. And you go, oh, okay, we're in this together. And soon you start experiencing spiritual growth and you recognize that because you trust God with bigger things than you ever thought were possible. I wish I could tell you that those voices of discouragement would go away one day. But we live in a broken world. You're always gonna have a jealous coworker. You're always gonna have a negative Nancy, no offense if your name is Nancy, in your life that's discouraging you from doing something that you really feel convicted to do. And even if you could insulate yourself from all of the external voices of discouragement, you're always gonna have that voice inside that peeks its head up from time to time saying, are you sure you're good enough? Are you sure you're hearing clearly? That's just part of our broken condition, I'm afraid. But with the right strategy, you can overcome discouragement. You can look opposition in the face and say, I've got a plan. I'm gonna pray about this. I'm gonna prepare and plan, and I'm gonna press on. I am not gonna let discouragement have the final word. We're gonna come to a time in our life where we're gonna say, God, are you gonna show up? Are you gonna meet us there? And I believe he will. Just know this, friends. He loves you, he created you, he's there with you, and he will fight for you. So keep moving forward. Will you pray with me? Heavenly Father, I just thank you so much for the opportunity to look at a story like Nehemiah's, specifically this episode in the story in which he starts to experience what it's like to be opposed by people outside of the ranks, and even opposed, it seems like God, discouraged by people within his own ranks. And God, I pray that folks here and folks that listen online or one of our other campuses, God, they may be able to identify with what it's like to recognize and face discouragement. And God, that through Nehemiah's example, we might have a game plan, a strategy to face discouragement ourselves, to overcome and defeat it, and to keep moving forward in faith, to experience the best part of a relationship with you. Father, I thank you so much for your son, Jesus Christ. I thank you for the way that he made a way for us to have access to you, a relationship with you, and find our true purpose and calling in life. God, I pray these things in his name. Amen.